I wanted to understand the psychology of our spiritual longing and our attraction to charismatic teachers. And what happens if a teacher begins to act out their shadow? Because, that's what I've been writing about all these years. What if they begin to act out their dark side? They're shaming, they're critical, they're punitive, they take people's money. Then how do people respond? How do they recover from that? Because it took me a long time to recover, and I wasn't the subject of explicit, overt abuse.
Before we get into the show, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, First Human, of which I am a co-founder. First Human is dedicated to extraordinary impact in the world through exceptional leadership. So if you're looking to elevate the leadership of your team or your organization, then do check us out. We also offer one-to-one coaching. So if you'd like to get coached by me or one of my extraordinarily talented fellow coaches, then head over to firsthuman.com. And with that, back to the show. And welcome to another episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say I'm here with Connie Zweig. She is a retired Jungian therapist and co-author of multiple books, including Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. Her award-winning book, which is the one I've read, is called The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, and extends shadow work into midlife and beyond, and explores aging as a spiritual practice. Her book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light on Our Search for Awakening, extends shadow work into religion and spirituality. Connie has been doing contemplative practices for more than 50 years, and very excited to share she has a new podcast. It's called Dr. Neil's Spiritual Awakening to Non-Duality, which she's started with her husband, her first creative project with her husband, and that started recently. So a woman of many talents, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to the show, Connie.
Thank you. So glad to be with you.
Wonderful. So for those who are not familiar with you or your work, as I like to do with many of our guests, I'd love to start at the beginning and get a sense of your background, a bit of your childhood, your parents, where you grew up, and those formative years for you, Connie, if you would care to elaborate.
Wow. Hundreds of interviews. Nobody's asked me that. I grew up in Los Angeles, in kind of a middle-class suburb. My parents didn't have a lot of money when they were first married, but then my dad got a good job. And I have a sister who's 2 years younger than I am. And I loved school right from the beginning. I really thrived in learning and was interested in everything. And graduated high school, went to college at Berkeley in the late 60s. And that was very formative because it was the time of the Vietnam War, the time of the Black Power movement. And I've been very political all my life, politically active. And also during that time in my early 20s, I learned Transcendental Meditation. And even though I only stayed with that for a few years, it was also really formative because I learned that meditation could quiet my mind and give me a sense of internal refuge that I've had all of my life. And I'm really, really grateful for that. So those are some key moments from my early life.
And was that your first spiritual experience or exposure to spiritual practice? Was it Berkeley with the Transcendental Meditation, or were there earlier inklings, earlier in your childhood?
In my childhood, my mother was a painter, and she studied with a Japanese teacher who really brought Zen, some Zen teachings to my mother. They went to Japan, and she learned flower arranging, and So there was a kind of an early Asian influence, which I didn't realize at the time really kind of shaped my aesthetic. But I didn't really begin any spiritual practice until my 20s.
Right. And how did your family react to that? Was that something they encouraged? Did they think it was
Well,
kooky?
I mean, my parents were Jewish, but they were not religious at all. They were culturally Jewish. So they were open-minded. I think it was when I became really politically radicalized that they became worried. And then after that, I went off to become a TM teacher, and that was unsettling for them because they didn't know, what it was about and what would happen to me. So those were two sort of issues that created some confusion and some distance with my family.
And how did you navigate that?
Well, my dad and I had a really good intellectual banter, and we could kind of talk about political issues. He was for the Vietnam War. In those days, a lot of people of his generation were. Didn't understand what was happening with race in the country. And I got very involved in Black politics at Berkeley and studying the history of racism and very engaged with it politically. So, it was just a conversation, but it was definitely, when I look at it now, Richard, as a psychologist, what I see was that I needed to separate from my family because they were so kind of over-involved in who I was. And I think a lot of people feel this. A lot of people enjoy really close families and they don't have to break away. But for me, I needed to kind of break away and find my own path. And I think both of those, the politics and the spirituality, were pieces of that, what we call in psychology, separation and individuation. Later in life, I was able to talk about that with my parents, but at the time when it was happening, it was all kind of big drama. And my sister didn't go through that. She basically didn't leave Los Angeles, didn't rebel, and didn't marry, and had a really different life, and remained close to them, whereas I really kind of went for more autonomy.
Right. And describe transcendental meditation. Like, what was your first experience of that? How did it impact you?
Well, I learned that practice at the TM Center in Berkeley, California. And what happened was I had a very noisy mind because it was kind of over-intellectualized. And I was a big reader and student. And I was also very angry because of the politics of the time. And what happened in that very first meditation was I got quiet inside. I experienced awareness without thought. And I hadn't even known that that was possible. Most people don't know that's possible. So I was aware, I was quiet inside. No object of attention, no sensation, no feeling, no thought, just pure awareness. And that was a breakthrough for me. That was a turning point that made me realize there was more than the mind, the thinking mind. There was more to experience and explore than the contents of consciousness. And so that experience has always stayed with me. It's more than 50 years ago now. And I've gone on to many other practices and many other teachers. But that was really a turning point for me.
And did you get it like the first time? Because I'm now meditating, but I had many, many, many false starts before I got to my practice. Was it like the first time you dropped onto the mat, you kind of got that awareness, or
Yes,
did it
it
take some time?
happened that way. I mean, it was
Oh, wow.
yeah, it was an initiation process, where there was a ceremony and they gave me a mantra, and I went into that state. It's a state of consciousness. But I would say to you, there are no false starts. I think that's kind of a critical way to look at it. There are many schools of meditation. Some of them just teach being present and noticing what's going on. Some of them teach focusing on your breath or on your kundalini. Many different kinds, or on a candle, right? Many different kinds of practices. And so we all are where we are. And I think it's important not to bring in psychology, we say our superego, the parental parent voice inside of us to our spiritual practice, to our yoga mat, because those practices are really about freedom from that. So we don't want to carry that with us.
No, I suppose fair enough. But it sounds to me like you were able to drop into a practice quite quickly after your initial experience, and then you felt called to teach this. That was your next move, was it?
Yeah, I spent about 10 years in the TM movement, teaching that practice all over the country, traveling, living in different cities, and teaching that practice. And then a number of things happened in the TM movement in the 1970s. There were some scandals. There were some practices being taught that were really unappealing to me. There was a sort of competition among people to experience these states of consciousness. And it just became unappealing to me, and I left. So I left, I think, in 1979 or 80. And it was difficult to leave because all my friends were in that community. The teachings were very precious to me, but it no longer felt comfortable. It no longer felt like it had integrity for me to stay in that community. So, and I know people who never left it. I actually saw some this weekend, and I know other people, who left at different periods. And this is true, I think, in all spiritual communities. And that's what Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path is about. I wanted to write a book for people who either struggled like I did with some of the values and behaviors of their teacher and of their community and didn't know what to do, couldn't speak up, felt trapped, or actually really experienced abuse, because there's a lot of physical, emotional, and financial abuse in some of these communities. That wasn't my experience, but many, many people I interviewed have religious trauma from the abuse they experienced. And this could be in any denomination, right? In a church, in a synagogue, in a mosque, in a sangha, in a zendo, right? In a shamanic group. It's non-denominational. I wanted to understand the psychology of our spiritual longing and our attraction to charismatic teachers. And what happens if a teacher begins to act out their shadow? Because, that's what I've been writing about all these years. What if they begin to act out their dark side? They're shaming, they're critical, they're punitive, they take people's money. Then how do people respond? How do they recover from that? Because it took me a long time to recover, and I wasn't the subject of explicit, overt abuse. I would say it was covert. It was hypocrisy. But it took me a long time to recover from leaving my community. And so I wanted to help guide people about that.
And I'm interested in what was the hypocrisy that you experienced?
Well, like I was saying, there was a sense when the TM teacher, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, started giving out advanced practices, what he called advanced practices. People were making claims that obviously weren't true to me. They were making claims that they were having certain spiritual experiences like levitation and other things that were just Obviously not true. And then there were some, Maharishi had asked people who were close to him to be celibate. He used to say that celibacy was a quicker path to awakening than the householder path. And then there were reports that he was sleeping with women. And so between those two things, it became too uncomfortable for me. Other people didn't feel that way, but for me, it was no longer congruent.
Right. And where did that leave you in terms of your relationship with spirituality in general?
Well, I had a few years of real disillusionment, and I would say even heartbreak. You know, if he could behave that way, was he really awake? Right? If people are in advanced levels of consciousness, do they act out their shadows? How do those things fit together? That's really what I wanted to explore and to write about. So I ended up, years later in the 1990s, going back to school to get a Ph.D. in psychology. And that's what I wrote my dissertation about. I called it The Holy Longing. What is this longing for transcendence, for pure awareness, for divinity, for interconnectedness, what we now call non-duality? What is our longing for that really about? And could I explore that using psychology to help people understand that? And then how does that lead us to these situations where we're being taken advantage of? You know, a teacher is asking for more money and more money and more money, or telling people to keep secrets from each other, or in some cases, physically kicking and hitting people. So there are many stories in Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path of religious abuse, of the teachers who have acted out their shadows. And then there's a program for how to recover from that, how to do spiritual shadow work to get through that. And it took me, myself, a long time to recover from that disillusionment and to sort of kindle the spark again of my interest in spirituality.
Right. And what did you conclude then about, this relationship with, because you describe in the book, and the book that I've read is the Inner Work of Age, but you did describe this to some extent in that book. Is this a sort of a necessary aspect of the guru, that they will have a shadow side, that they will act out? Or, what did you conclude about that?
No, I don't think that it's necessary, but I do think every human being has shadow material. We have repressed, buried, forbidden, unconscious, denied material. That's the nature of the psyche. The psyche has an unconscious. And what happens is that as people advance in their spiritual development, if they don't also do their psychological work, their moral development, their emotional or relational development, then it's possible at some point that the shadow will act out. So we have all these people for decades who were trained in the East, right, in Tibet, Nepal, China, Japan, coming to the West, India, coming to the West, being trained in monastic cultures, and then all of a sudden they're with these women who are half-dressed, dancing around, right? Freedom of expression, freedom of sexuality. What happens in that culture clash? Mm. And, that's just one example of sexual shadow that can act out. One of the things, Ken Wilber has written about lines of development, which I found really helpful. So if we only develop our spiritual line, for example, and we become highly advanced spiritually, that doesn't mean that we're emotionally developed. or morally developed or intellectually developed or musically developed. My husband and I met a yogi in India. We went to Rishikesh to meet this Kundalini master, and he had lived as a sadhu wandering in India, celibate. And we knew what his spiritual level was, but what happened when we met him was he only spoke to my husband. He never looked at me. He didn't respond to anything I said. And he was sexist. And he was unrelated. He didn't have any communication skills. So you can see that his life experience only allowed him this one line of development. It didn't require him to learn how to be relational, right? Or to learn how to be intellectual or musical. And, what mostly interests me is it didn't allow him to do moral development, ethical moral development, right?
Right.
So there are a lot of teachers now who are struggling with these issues. I'm part of a whole community of people who are trying to train teachers in moral development. It's called Association for Spiritual Integrity.
Right.
So, that's something that is close to my heart because I had my own version of heartbreak and disillusionment around spirituality. And I've had more than one. I mean, I could tell you all kinds of experiences with other people, So everyone has a shadow. A different way to look at it is there is, the chakra system?
Yes.
In the subtle bodies. So every chakra has shadow material stored in it. That's another way to look at it. So in the subtle body, let's say in the second chakra, there's sexual shadow material repressed. Or in the third chakra, there's power shadow material repressed, right? So that can emerge or erupt in unexpected ways. And, in terms of the inner work of age, part of what I see about aging well, aging consciously, shifting our identity from role to soul, which for me is the purpose of age, right? Spiritual purpose of age. Part of that is finishing the unfinished business of our religious and spiritual lives. And especially as we approach death. So I talk to so many people who are afraid of death because they haven't worked out their fear of hell and punishment. They haven't worked out their guilt or their shame from religious communities and religious dogma, right? So that's where these books overlap in the sense that these experiences can happen at any age, but in the late stage of life, it's really important to begin to work them through and make peace with all of our traumatic experiences as well as all of our really positive, beneficial experiences.
Right. And I love what you said there regarding lines of development, which you took from Wilber. And there was a passage in the book which I loved that, which I completely resonated with. You took, many of us have the experience of psychotherapy in that it's limited in terms of our spiritual connection. We've also had experiences of contemplative practices that have felt limited in terms of emotional healing. And I was like, that's exactly
Yes.
right. That's exactly my experience. And it's taken me a while to sort of be clear on that, but that's exactly my experience. And so I'm curious then, if we're developing ourselves, is this something we ought to be developing all lines simultaneously, or do we take one line for a while and then sort of rest it and move to another line? What's the sort of strategy for evolution given that reality?
Well, Wilber calls it integral practice. So, I think for everyone, there's an individual journey. I don't think there's a should here. I don't think there's a rule here. Some people who in a very at a very young age clearly have a musical gift or an athletic gift, right? Or a language gift. And so that line of development can be seen and encouraged and validated early on. Some kids are born with early spiritual experiences. I mean, I've heard that too. So some kids come in really related. Like one of my friends whose son I've known his whole life, that kid just knew how to talk to people from the beginning. He could just build rapport and respond to people. And, so we have our gifts and our aptitudes. And this is different for different people. I have a friend in his 70s who just went back to school because he wants to develop intellectually, cognitive development. There are people now who are so healthy in their later years, they're taking up sports and athletics and becoming more body-centered, right? In their 60s or their 70s. Yeah. That's really not happened before. So I don't, or picking up another,
bodybuilders.
Or picking up another language, which is a particular developmental skill because it exercises a certain region of the brain. So I don't think there are any rules about this. Some of it is awareness of our limitations, our blind spots, and where we might put our attention. So if we're really strong in one particular area, we might put our attention on something else and just kind of see what's calling to us. Maybe it's the arts. My literary agent retired after running a business for many years, and she paints full-time. And she said she's totally shocked at how much she loves it. She didn't even know, she never dreamed about being an artist, but there you go. So it's very individual.
Mm. And I heard, or I read something recently regarding this relationship between spiritual development and emotional development. And a potential critique of engaging in therapy was, well, that's still feeding the ego, because really that's an expression of the ego wanting to fix itself by doing more and more inner child work or therapy work. And really at a certain point we just need to let go of that ego need, if you like, and focus on our spiritual development. And that didn't quite resonate with me, because the way I saw it was this emotional work allowed me to do the deeper spiritual work, and they were mutually supporting. But I wonder what your response to that is.
Well, I'm deeply saddened by what's happened to the field of psychology, because it's moved more and more into, what's called CBT, focusing on thoughts and brief therapy and the brain. And it's moved away from soul or psyche or the unconscious. And so from my point of view, if you are working, for example, with a Jungian analyst and your dreams, that's not about building up your ego. Or if you are working with, a spiritual director who is connecting you to your religious feelings and what they're about and your motivations, that's not necessarily building your ego. So there has historically been this lack of a bridge between psychology and spirituality. There was an era of transpersonal psychology in the 1970s in the West that was fabulous. It was trying to build this bridge and look at human development. In psychology, we have developmental psychology, and they were adding spiritual development onto that map so that there was one big map. And that really, Ken Wilber ended up taking all of that and really turning it into integral. So integral is a place where psychology and spirituality are not separated. For me, whenever I taught shadow work to my clients and in my books, I see shadow work as a spiritual practice. When we explore the unconscious, when we explore the most difficult, challenging, scary parts of ourselves, right? we need some kind of centering practice. We need a way to come back to the breath, to come back to our ground, whatever we call that, our center. And so I always taught meditation when I taught shadow work to my clients. To me, they're intricately connected because otherwise you don't have the roots you don't have the groundedness to face these difficult parts of yourself, your anger or your hate or your jealousy or your rage or even your grief. It can be overwhelming to people. And we don't want to overwhelm the psyche. That's not the goal of shadow work. So for me, the spiritual centering work and the psychological inner work really go hand in hand. And unfortunately, that's not where the field is at large. There are very few. I don't know in the UK and Europe. I mean, there are lots of Jungian associations on the continent, but here, the field itself has been medicalized, and because of insurance and drug companies, it's just moved in a completely different direction.
Yeah, well, and that really resonates, and I think it is a similar pattern in the UK. I mean, CBT is almost synonymous with
Right.
therapy in some
Right.
senses.
Right.
And yes, it is largely medicalized. And what you're saying resonates in my experience, because I would perhaps go to a yoga class or perhaps try and do some meditation and then do my therapy. And the therapist was telling me, don't do any transcendental meditation. That's just spiritual bypass, and that's going to take you away from your feelings. But then often the spiritual teachers would be like, no, don't indulge your feelings. You want to be out of your ego. You want to be out of you. And I sort of had to but intrinsically and, intuitively, I knew that both of these were beneficial. So I wasn't going to stop doing either of them. I just sort of figured out my own sort of navigation, almost riding two horses. But, I can see how beneficial it might have been had I found practitioners who saw the integration as you just described.
Yeah, so let's pick up that word you just used, spiritual bypass. So, that refers to the idea that we can somehow bypass, go beyond our shadow material, our ego needs, our drive, our emotional development, right? By transcending them, by spiritual practice in which we just empty the mind and don't care anymore, right? Because we get unattached and we move beyond them. But from my point of view, that is exactly where people land who end up committing spiritual abuse, right? Because they don't have that self-awareness of their own blind spots, even of their own needs. Let's say there's a student or a teacher who really needs to feel special and be seen and be adored. And that's what their dynamic is about. So that's a setup, right, for demanding obedience. Well, if you don't obey me, I'm not going to give this to you. I'm not going to meet your childhood needs, right? But if you know that you have those needs because you've done psychological work, then you can kind of be free inside to evaluate, is this a healthy situation? Like when I was evaluating the TM movement, is this right for me? Do I still feel belonging here? Do I still feel aligned with the mission and with the words? And if I hadn't been able to do that, I might have been stuck there for a long time, feeling uncomfortable, feeling alone because other people weren't experiencing that. So this connection to our own shadow awareness and the perception of another person's shadow awareness is really important in our spiritual lives. There are yoga teachers I write about in the book who are seducing women all over the place. right? So what happens if you are unaware of why you need that yoga teacher, and yet you become aware of what he's doing or she's doing?
Mm.
How do you live with that internal conflict, that dissonance inside? People get sick from this. And then when they leave, they end up getting PTSD because they really suffered abuse. I mean, there's assault going on in some of these communities, right? It's in the record. We know we know what's going on. So I think that spiritual bypass, which I think was happening a lot in the early days, in the 60s and 70s when teachers were first coming here, there was a sense that all we have to do is meditate. We don't have to work on ourselves anymore. Who cares about yoga and therapy? We don't, all we have to do is meditate. And now, after decades of this kind of transplantation into the West, it's much more sophisticated, and we're aware of the complexity, and people are building these bridges with psychology. And it's no longer okay for spiritual teachers to be unaware of psychology, to have no empathy. It's just not acceptable anymore.
Right. And that's very encouraging to hear that is a movement. And it's something I see, I hear this on the podcast a lot, and this is occurring not just in the spiritual realm, but I had somebody on the show recently who was talking about bringing psychotherapeutic awareness and trauma awareness to sports coaching, right?
Yes.
So I think there is this permeation of an awareness of the emotional body, of trauma and healing.
Yes.
It sounds like to spiritual circles, but to many other realms of
yes.
life.
There's so many coaches who've been found to be committing sexual abuse. Yeah. So the whole Me Too movement has changed this culturally, I think, around the world, but it hasn't stopped it. Right? It hasn't solved the problem, but it's brought awareness to it. So then the question is, well, now what do we do with that awareness? And what I'm suggesting is, when we cultivate shadow awareness of ourselves and of others, a teacher, a professor, a coach, a clergy person, a guru, we have a much more conscious dynamic. We can see the red flags more quickly. We can recognize our own denial, our own motivations. We can recognize the risk points for the other person, So I think you're making a good point. This is not only in the spiritual domain. This is going on, and with politicians too. It's going on.
Man. If ever there was a class of people who could use a great degree of emotional awareness.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's right. And it's encouraging to hear.
And I think, the spiritual teachers who say don't pay attention to your trauma are really, that's denial. Right? That's a defense. That's like when I hear that, well, I can't help you with that, so don't bother. I'll help you with this. Right? But in the inner work of age, when we do a life review, which is a really beautiful practice to do in your 60s or 70s, and you look back at everything that's happened and the important people you've met and the events and, the insights and the breakthroughs, you also look at the traumas, right? Because they're still with you. They're in your psyche. They're in your body. And so I've had many, many people say to me, they went back into therapy after reading the book. And maybe they're like 75 years old, but they recognize that they don't want to take that with them to the end of life. They don't want to be on the deathbed feeling like, I can't forgive him. I'll
Right.
never forgive him. We don't want to feel that when we're dying, right? So the trauma work is very connected, as we're saying, to the spiritual work, but also to age and to the inner work of age and to expanding our identity from our story, because we're not our story. That's not who we are. I am not my trauma, right? I am not a victim. I am not a perpetrator, right? I am not my roles. You know, you get into your 70s, you retire, and you realize your roles fall away. I am not my roles. They're fleeting, right? And I am not my history, and I am not my money. And all these things that people identify with begin to fall away. So who am I? So
Yeah, and I think that's the great paradox of doing the deeper therapeutic work, in my experience, is as people can look at that and think, yeah, but if you go and drag all that stuff up, you're just going to enhance your victim consciousness, and you're going to, give energy and attention to your story, and you'll get sort of stuck in that. And the opposite is true. Right? You feel into that and you release that. It's freedom from that. It sounds counterintuitive, but that's absolutely the experience. Well, my experience of doing the deeper work is
so
that's what
glad.
happens.
I'm glad you have that experience. I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, it's not everyone's experience. Some people can get stuck there and take many years before they can let go, right? It can take, if harm has been done to them, it can take many years to let go. But the intention to let go can even be freeing. The intention to release it is really the first step. And then getting the right guidance, the right support, the right practices for letting go, right? And as we let go, and people are afraid of letting go of those identities because what's next is so unknown.
Right.
Well, if I'm not that trauma survivor, who am I? You know, if I don't define myself by hating my father, who am I? Right?
Yeah.
Or by hating my ex-husband, or by, feeling rejected by my child, then who am I? Right? So those kind of traumas can be very difficult for people to let go because at the level of identity.
Yeah.
And it sounds like for you, you've been able to kind of shake them loose.
Yeah, I mean, and it has been a multi-year project. It's not like I do a session and this is hundreds of hours of therapy. But the experience is of a letting go, and the deeper I do the work, and the more I fall into the tears and the grief, the more rapid the excisement from the system. If that makes sense.
Yes.
So, but back to age, I think. I think you're saying something very important there, that this is a wonderful opportunity for people, who may have not had, and you talk about that, you make I think a good point in the book about privilege, and I feel somewhat privileged to have had the time and the money to have explored, my therapeutic process to the extent that I have, and I recognize that I've been lucky in a sense to. I mean, it obviously took courage on my part to go there, but I also was fortunate to have the resources to do so. But many people, as they age, will find themselves certainly with more time, if not more money, to do this work.
Yeah, there's the time, and then there's the question, to do what? Right? What do I want to do with this time now? And the answer is very different for different people. Right? I mean, right now in the States, people are getting really politically engaged. I mean, the next few months, it's what's going to be about for some people. Other people have been doing that for years, right? Or people feel a passion for hunger or for climate, and they want to engage. And that's beautiful. You can be an elder activist and leave a contribution, share your gifts, share your wisdom, and leave a contribution. And other people are more introverted and they want to be a more contemplative elder. And so they go to a lot of meditation retreats and they focus on their own spirituality. And that isn't necessarily selfish. It can be about cultivating compassion. It can be about spreading silence and peace to their family members, right? It can be about doing the inner work of age, making meaning out of their lives so that they feel fulfilled at the end of their lives. Some people are more practical and they want to do all the practical stuff like, finish their trust and their death plans and getting their finances in order so that their families don't have to deal with that. So there are many ways for people to answer that question, what do I want to do now? But the deeper question is not about doing, right? It's who am I? Right? So you can be doing anything, but you're not the doer, right? If you make this internal shift in awareness, I am not the doer, I am a soul, or I am spirit, or I am divine, or I am Christ nature, or Buddha nature, then whatever it is you're doing is going to be influenced by that deeper identity, that deeper awareness, that recognition. I mean, you mentioned ego, the recognition that it's not my ego that's doing this. My ego can't control the outcomes. You start to recognize that as you age, and it's so freeing. I'm not in control. I'm not in charge. I'm a soul on a journey, or whatever your words are for that, right? Whatever language works for you to feel comfortable with that spiritual identity that connects you to everything, that lifts you out of your separateness and your willfulness and connects you to all living things. One woman called it, I am the breath that moves through everything, right?
Yeah.
Or it could be, I am pure consciousness. Whatever works for you. So you could be volunteering or grandparenting or being an activist or being a meditator, whatever it is, a gardener, a poet, a painter, right? Whatever the doing is, beneath the doing is this deeper identity. And that allows us to do aging as spiritual practice. That allows us to use the circumstances of our age to become more aware and more developed and more spiritually advanced, rather than shrinking, becoming invisible, full of regret and bitterness, which we see, a lot of us see in a lot of older adults. And it's hard.
Well, it's almost a stereotype. I think it's certainly for old men, the cantankerous old man, right?
Right. It's yeah. So, last night I was on a call with more than 10,000 people, elders for Kamala, right? Kamala Harris is running for president here. And it was fantastic to see all these older people like full of enthusiasm and wanting to be engaged in everything, right? So it's not about what we do, it's about how we do it. The quality of awareness we bring to our doing.
And I mean, you talked in the book about other traditions where this was more understood. But, when I think about public consciousness and, our relationship with old people, it tends to be, one of concern, making sure they're looked after. In the UK, there's a lot of controversy right now because the current government may be taking the winter fuel allowance away, which, obviously benefited a lot of old people. So, but that tends to be often the context and of course the health issues that come with old age. We very rarely hear people talking about this golden opportunity for spiritual development.
Yes.
But there are other traditions where that is the case, where we do recognize the spiritual phase of
Well,
the afternoon of life, as you describe it.
Yeah, indigenous communities all over the world have initiations into elderhood, but postmodern Western mainstream culture has an epidemic of ageism. It worships youth. It worships productivity and success and image, how we look, right? And that doesn't go with aging and the physical changes and the cognitive changes and the slowdown that come, for many people with aging. And so there's this contrast. And in some ways, it was very apparent during the pandemic. I don't know what it was like in the UK, but here it was very apparent. There were people making comments like, let all those old people in the nursing homes die. I mean, there was shocking ageism that really came to the surface at that time. And I think it's because we're this youth-oriented culture that's all about success and looks. So it's very difficult to age in that context. And, in our culture, there's one political party that wants to get rid of Social Security and Medicare. I mean, it's totally shocking that anybody could even think that, right? So I know that the people have a hard time. People have there's a lot of drug addiction, there's alcohol addiction, there's a lot of depression and anxiety that come with older age. There's a lot of loneliness, just an epidemic of loneliness in Western culture. And partly because we don't have community built in, and partly because of ageism. We don't have the support net. You guys have more of a support net than we do. So I'm not Pollyanna here. I'm not saying, we should just go off and meditate and it's easy. This is all in the context of many spiritual and religious traditions from time immemorial have taught that the purpose of old age is contemplation. And it's about learning practices. The monastic cultures, teach you go to the monastery, you go to the cave, you leave the family and you just go meditate. Well, that's not going to happen for most of us. But we can create our own little natural monasteries at home with a meditation cushion and a quiet time. And it doesn't have to be even in a religious context. I mean, it can be for people who want to do a Christian practice or a Jewish practice, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a neutral kind of practice. And it will allow you a kind of inner peace that may be unfamiliar. You don't even know that you want it because you've never experienced it. But it may be unfamiliar. But it's actually, from my point of view, fulfilling the purpose of this new longevity. People used to die at 45, right? So now they're living twice as long. And we're not really set up for all that lifespan. People don't know what to do with themselves. So everybody I interviewed for the inner work of age told me they were disoriented. They were kind of lost. They didn't know the purpose of this time. They didn't know the meaning of it. So that was really why I wrote the book. I wanted to help people to learn the inner work that connects them to the shadow, to their unconscious feelings and thoughts and motivations, and learn the spiritual work that connects them to spirit, to the transpersonal. And with those two kind of tools, because there are a lot of practices, every chapter in the book has practices. So there's practices for retirement, for illness, for activism, all kinds of things. And it has helped people to reorient to who they are and how they want to contribute now. And that's been really gratifying for me, really gratifying.
Wonderful. Oh God, I feel like we're at time already. God, I feel like we could go on and on. But yeah, Connie, this is fantastic to hear from you. What a great message, and
Yeah.
something that I'm now motivated to explore more on this show, because it isn't something we talk about. I mean, we talk a lot about spirituality and emotional healing and so on, but not specifically in the context of aging.
So important.
Yeah. So thank you for that contribution.
Thank you.
All right. Well, so for those of you, we'll put the links to the book, The Inner Work of Age, plus your other books we mentioned at the start. Where anywhere else you would send people who resonate with what you've shared today?
Well, there are lots of videos on my website, conniezweig.com. ConnieZweig.com. Lots of videos you can watch there, including from other teachers as well as myself. I'm not really teaching workshops much anymore, but if there are people who are listening who want to create a book club around one of these books, and for the age book, I call it a wisdom circle. For the spiritual shadow book, I call it a spiritual shadow work group. You can send me an email, conniezweig@gmail.com, and put in the subject line, wisdom circle or spiritual shadow work, and then give me your time zone. So if you're in Europe, let me know where. If you're in the States, let me know where. And I will try to connect you with other people in your time zone, because these groups are all on Zoom.
Okay.
They're free. They're free. They're leaderless. Some of them have formed such intimate friendships that they've been going for a couple of years now. They don't want to stop. Yeah, there's hundreds of them. They're all over the world. So if that's something you'd like, if you want to age in community and explore the book together with people, or do spiritual shadow work with others who've had similar experiences, you can shoot me an email. Please don't send me a long story in your email. Just let me know which group you'd like and where your time zone is, and I'll get back to you.
Okay. Well, thank you once again for sharing your wisdom on the show today.
Thank you so much.